Ever wondered how parents in Victorian England raised their children and why their methods would be shocking, and likely illegal, today? In this calm episode of the Snoozatorian, we drift back to an age of lace collars, candlelight, and cold discipline. An era where love was seldom spoken, where obedience was virtue, and where a single tear from a child could be mistaken for weakness. Tonight, we gently explore how an empire taught its children to behave, and what that cost them. The Victorian home, for all its elegance and order, was often a quiet battlefield of manners and emotions. Picture a drawing room lit by the soft glow of gas lamps. A little girl sits perfectly still on a wooden chair, hands folded, eyes fixed on the clock. She's waiting for her father's nod, permission to speak. Her legs ache, but she doesn't move. The house is silent, except for the faint ticking and the scratch of the clock hand. In the 1800s, childhood was not what we know today. Children were often seen as small adults, unfinished, imperfect creatures who needed to be shaped by rules, repetition, and silence. Modern psychologists might call it emotional neglect. But to Victorians, it was love. To them, discipline was kindness, and obedience was a moral duty. Parents believed that a strict upbringing created strength of character. Crying too much, laughing too loudly, or questioning an adult were considered signs of moral failure. Spare the rod and spoil the child wasn't just a saying, it was law in many homes. Children could be punished for slouching at the table, for muddy shoes, or even for looking bored. Some families had what they called an obedience chair, a small stool where children would sit motionless until they were ready to be good again. There were also those chilling morning rituals that sound almost unthinkable now. In some households, children were woken before dawn and made to bathe in cold water, even in winter, to strengthen the spirit. Doctors of the time claimed that warmth and comfort made children weak. Ice baths, tight corsets, strict posture, they were all meant to build endurance, not break it. And yet, many children broke anyway, quietly, without a sound. But not every Victorian home was cruel. In the quiet corners of that stern world, love still found ways to whisper. Some parents read bedtime stories softly by candlelight. Some mothers hid sweets under pillows when their children had nightmares. And some fathers, though unable to say "I love you," would tuck the blanket a little tighter at night, their version of tenderness in a world that discouraged it. For many, parenting wasn't guided by affection but by fear of failure, of gossip, of raising a spoiled child. Society itself demanded obedience. Schools reflected that same cold order. Teachers used canes, rulers, and long hours of memorization. A child who dared to question a lesson was quickly corrected, not just with words, but with the weight of shame. And yet, beneath the surface of that polished, prim society, something began to change. By the late 1800s, voices began to rise, soft at first, then stronger. Writers and reformers started asking, what if love, not fear, made better citizens? What if kindness raised stronger children than punishment ever could? One such voice belonged to a woman named Mary Carpenter, a schoolteacher from Bristol. She opened what she called ragged schools for poor and neglected children, places where she taught through patience and praise instead of pain. She was mocked for her softness. Some said she'd raise criminals by being too gentle. But her students flourished. For the first time, the poorest children of Victorian Britain were allowed to learn without fear. Others followed. Dr. Charles Kingsley, a clergyman and writer, began to speak out about the damage of emotional repression. He wrote that the human heart, whether child or man, is not a stone to be carved but a garden to be tended. His words spread quietly through the parlors and drawing rooms of England. A few parents began to listen. Still, the old ways held strong. In many upper-class homes, nannies ruled the nursery with cold precision. Mothers, guided by society's harsh expectations, were told to see their children only at set hours, often just a few minutes each day. Too much affection, they were warned, spoils the character. So a generation grew up learning to bow before they ever learned to hug. Imagine being a child then, hearing your mother's voice from across the hall but never being allowed to run into her arms. You'd grow up believing love was something distant, something earned only through perfect behavior. That quiet ache shaped the emotional world of the Victorians, a world where adults, once children of silence, passed that same silence to the next generation. And yet, even in that rigid order, love refused to die. Children found it in small gestures, a ribbon mended, a lullaby hummed when the governess wasn't looking, a smile quickly hidden behind a handkerchief. There was tenderness between the cracks of the marble facade. By the end of the century, the first laws protecting children from abuse began to appear. The Children's Charter of 1889 was one of the earliest attempts to say, officially, that a child was not property, but a person. It was a small beginning, imperfect, delayed, but it marked the slow turning of a moral tide. Victorian parenting would seem cruel by modern standards, but in their minds, it was necessary, a reflection of the world they knew, a world of struggle, survival, and social pressure. Parents loved their children even when they didn't know how to show it. As the lamps flicker and we drift deeper into that world, it's worth remembering that history is not just a list of laws or customs. It's the story of hearts learning, generation by generation, how to be softer, how to love more openly, how to understand what kindness really means. The Victorians, for all their mistakes, began that journey, perhaps without knowing it. They built the first conversations about what a child deserves. They questioned whether obedience should come before affection. And though their homes were often filled with silence, they left behind the echoes of that question, a question we still ask today. Would we have been kinder, if we were them? Perhaps we'll never know. But as we close our eyes tonight and drift toward sleep, we can be quietly grateful that the world learned, slowly but surely, that love should never be rationed. That a warm embrace can teach more than 1,000 rules ever could. The gas lamps burn low, and the streets of London are still damp from the night rain. Somewhere beyond the fog, a horse cart creaks past a row of narrow houses. Behind one window, a mother sits quietly, mending a small shirt by candlelight. Her name, in the parish record, would mean little, Mrs. Eleanor Briggs, age 34, mother of 4. Yet her story, and thousands like it, told the truth of Victorian parenting far better than any rulebook ever could. In her world, love was never absent, only hidden, buried under duty, wrapped in fear. Eleanor's children were expected to be good, though the word carried a different meaning then. Good meant silent. Good meant still. Good meant never asking why. Each morning, before sunrise, she would wake them. The room was cold, the fire unlit to save coal. The eldest, Arthur, only 12, helped lace his younger sister's boots, careful not to let her cry. Crying was weakness, and weakness was a sin. They would stand in a row by the window while their father read from Proverbs, "He that spareth his rod hateth his son." The words were sharp, but to him, they were love. And yet, beneath that discipline, Eleanor's heart broke a little more each day. She'd been raised the same way, taught that affection made children soft. So she loved them quietly, with a careful mending of socks, with warm bread left waiting, with silent prayers whispered as they slept. That was how most Victorian love survived, through acts, not words. A mother's kindness lived in the unnoticed gestures, the hidden care behind closed doors. For every harsh command, there was a secret tenderness. For every punishment, a quiet regret. But they seldom said it aloud. Across town, in a very different house, another mother lived by another rulebook. Lady Winthrop, a woman of wealth and name, believed her duty was to raise perfect children, children who reflected the family's reputation. Her daughter, Charlotte, only 8 years old, wore starched collars and practiced her curtsy before every meal. If Charlotte slouched, she'd spend an hour balancing a book on her head. If she fidgeted, her governess would tie a ribbon around her wrists to keep her still. The servants whispered that she was too thin, too pale, but Lady Winthrop dismissed them. She must learn composure, she'd say. A lady's value lies in restraint. Charlotte's world was filled with dolls that never smiled and rooms that never echoed with laughter. But in her diary, a little leather book hidden beneath her pillow, she wrote small rebellions. "I wish Mama would hold me like the nurse does my baby brother." That single line, lost to time, said everything about Victorian childhood. It wasn't that parents didn't love, it was that they didn't know how to show it without shame. Even in schools, affection was discouraged. Teachers were told never to smile too much, never to comfort a crying pupil. The goal was obedience, not warmth. One headmaster famously wrote, "A child should fear his teacher, for fear brings diligence." Yet, slowly, that fear began to crack. In the slums of Manchester, a teacher named Thomas Guthrie started noticing something strange. The poorest children, the ones who came barefoot and hungry, often learned faster when they were treated kindly. He began greeting them with a smile instead of a scolding. He allowed them to rest when tired, to speak when curious. And something miraculous happened, they flourished. His ragged school, once dismissed as sentimental folly, became a model for compassion-based teaching. Other educators followed, risking their reputations to challenge the cold ideals of the age. Meanwhile, newspapers began printing letters from concerned citizens, soft revolutions written in ink. One wrote, "We punish our children for crying, then wonder why our men grow up unable to weep." Another asked, "If obedience is all we teach, who will teach them to be kind?" For every century, there comes a moment when the heart begins to speak louder than tradition. The Victorian era, for all its steel and soot, was quietly reaching that point. In 1870, when the first Education Act passed, schools became mandatory for all children. It was a turning point, not just for learning, but for how society began to see childhood itself. For the first time, the government acknowledged that children were not miniature adults. They were individuals with minds and emotions worth protecting. But still, at home, the battle between affection and obedience continued. Many parents feared that the modern world, with its trains, machines, and factories, was making children too soft. The old sermon still echoed in parlors: "Discipline breeds virtue, comfort breeds sin." Eleanor Briggs, that quiet mother by the candlelight, would have nodded at those words, even as her heart disagreed. She could feel the old ways fading, even if she couldn't name what was replacing them. Sometimes, late at night, she'd watch her children sleeping and wonder if gentleness was really such a danger. History often moves not through wars, but through whispers like hers. By the 1880s, reformers began pushing for legal protection. Child labor, once considered normal, started to look like cruelty. Parliament debated age limits and school attendance. For the first time, lawmakers asked, "Does a child have rights?" The newspapers called it the moral question of the century. The answer came slowly, shaped by both compassion and guilt. England had built its empire on the backs of obedient children, chimney sweeps, factory hands, servant girls. Now it had to face what that obedience had cost. As the decades turned, Victorian parenting began to soften. The invention of photography helped. Suddenly, families saw their children not just as heirs or workers, but as faces, frozen in innocence. A photograph of a smiling child did something that sermons never could: it reminded people that tenderness was not weakness. New books appeared on child psychology, a strange and modern idea then. Doctors like James Sully and Alexander Bain began studying children's emotions. They spoke of play, imagination, and the need for affection. Their theories trickled into parlors and nurseries, slowly changing the way people spoke to their sons and daughters. But the old habits died hard. Many Victorians still believed that too much love spoiled character. They feared raising a generation unable to endure hardship. So they held back, even when their hearts ached to hold close. And yet, under that restraint, something beautiful survived. The children who grew up in that half-silent world, the ones who never heard "I love you," who sat on obedience chairs, who washed in ice water before dawn, they became the first parents of the modern age. They remembered how it felt to be unseen, unheard. And they promised their own children something different. That is the quiet gift of history: every generation heals what the last one didn't know how to. When we look back at Victorian parenting now, it's easy to judge, to call it cruel, heartless, outdated. But maybe it's better understood as a long, awkward chapter in humanity's education and love. Those parents weren't villains, they were students of survival. They lived in a world where sickness, poverty, and social shame were daily threats. To them, discipline was protection. To us, it feels like harm. Both can be true. The next time you see a photograph of a solemn Victorian child, remember, behind that still face was a heart learning how to endure. Behind that strict parent stood someone terrified of losing everything. History doesn't ask us to forgive, it asks us to understand. And as we drift further into this story, we begin to see how every rule, every punishment, every silence carried the same message: I love you, but I don't know how to show it. That's the strange, quiet tragedy of the Victorian home. And yet, from that silence, our modern idea of kindness was born. The candle burns lower now, and the house of Eleanor Briggs fades into shadow. The gaslights flicker out one by one across the foggy streets of London. Tomorrow, another generation will rise, one step closer to learning that love, not fear, builds stronger hearts. The fog over London has thinned, but the air still smells faintly of coal smoke and rain. It is the dawn of a new century. The year is 1901, and Queen Victoria's long reign is ending. Her death marks more than the fall of a monarch, it marks the fading of an entire way of life. In parlours across England, black crape hangs on doorways. But behind the mourning curtains, something else is happening, something quieter, more human. The children who once sat stiffly on obedience chairs are now adults. And many of them are quietly rethinking everything they were taught. Arthur Briggs, that boy who once stood by the cold window every morning, is now a father himself. He works at a small printing press near the Thames. His hands are rough, his back bent from years of labor, but his voice is gentle when he speaks to his own son, Peter. Sometimes he catches himself before raising his tone, remembering his father's booming voice, the sting of the strap, the silent dinners. He still believes in discipline, but something inside him whispers that kindness might be stronger. On winter nights, Arthur tells Peter stories his own father never told him. He reads from books that were once locked away, full of imagination and warmth. Jules Verne, Dickens, even fairy tales. His wife, Sarah, watches from her chair by the fire, smiling quietly. To them, bedtime isn't a time for scolding anymore. It's a time for peace. This small shift, this decision to speak softly instead of shouting, seems so simple, yet it represents a revolution centuries in the making. It's how the industrial age learned to be human again. Victorian children grew up surrounded by rules. They learned to bow, to thank, to obey. But what many of them never learned was how to feel, how to name sadness, how to admit fear, how to say I love you without shame. When they became adults, that emptiness followed them. Some turned cold, repeating the only language they knew. Others rebelled in silence, promising their children a gentler world. One of those quiet rebels was a writer named Florence Davies, born in 1875. She grew up under strict rules, forbidden to play outdoors without gloves, forbidden to laugh at the table, forbidden to question her elders. But as she grew older, she began to write stories about her childhood. She wrote about the fear of footsteps in the hall, the way her heart raced when she heard her father's cane. Her stories didn't blame, they remembered. In one passage, she wrote, "We were never hugged, but we were loved in every tidy button, every perfectly made bed." It took me years to see that love doesn't always look like love. Her words spread quietly among readers, mostly women who understood that same ache. Letters poured in, from mothers who felt trapped between the old world and the new, from daughters who longed for tenderness they had never known. And so, through literature, the conversation deepened. People began to name the things they had never dared to feel. For the first time, English families began to speak of affection not as weakness, but as health. Around the same time, science began to listen too. Psychologists like Sigmund Freud and later John Bowlby began exploring how childhood affection, or the lack of it, shaped the mind. Their ideas were controversial. Many Victorians dismissed them as foreign nonsense. But slowly, people began to notice the truth in them. A child who grew up unloved often carried that silence forever. A society that taught children to suppress emotion built adults who struggled to connect. The empire had conquered half the world, but its own people were learning to conquer their own hearts. Across Europe, orphanages began to change. The old dormitories of iron beds and cold porridge started to give way to smaller homes with warmth and color. Teachers began to smile more. Nurses began to comfort, not command. And in England, a quiet social revolution was brewing, not on the battlefields or in Parliament, but in nurseries, kitchens, and bedtime routines. Eleanor Briggs, now old and grey, lived long enough to see it happen. Her grandchildren were allowed to laugh freely in her house, something her own children had never dared. She often sat by the window, watching them play in the garden, and wondered at the sound of their joy. It felt foreign and familiar all at once, like hearing a forgotten song. Sometimes, she'd whisper to herself, "So this is what love looks like when it isn't afraid." For many Victorians, that realization came late, but it came nonetheless. The shift wasn't just emotional, it was written into law. The Children's Act of 1908 established new protections, banning cruelty, setting minimum ages for labor, and allowing inspectors to visit homes where abuse was suspected. For the first time, the state recognized that love wasn't just a private virtue, it was a public responsibility. But the transformation was slow. There were still those who clung to the old order, who believed that softness led to moral decay. Newspapers debated whether modern parenting was raising weak men. Sermons warned that affection would unman the nation. And yet, the tide kept turning. Because, at the quiet heart of it all, people were tired. Tired of being distant. Tired of mistaking fear for respect. Tired of hearts that couldn't speak. History doesn't always change through revolutions. Sometimes, it changes through lullabies. By the 1910s, photographs of smiling children filled family albums. Mothers, once told to stay distant, began writing advice books about affection, nutrition, and play. Fathers, who once saw themselves as stern providers, started spending evenings with their families instead of their clubs. The home, once a battlefield of manners, began to feel like a refuge. Of course, not everyone changed at once. Some households stayed frozen in the old rules. But for every strict home, there was another that softened, another small rebellion against silence. When we look at the past, it's easy to forget that progress is rarely loud. Most of it happens in kitchens and bedrooms, in the quiet decision to be gentler than the generation before. By the time Arthur Briggs grew old, he'd long stopped using the rod his father once swore by. He kept it in a drawer, out of sight, as a reminder, not of discipline, but of how far he'd come. And sometimes, when his son Peter tucked his own children into bed, he would tell them stories of the old days, when love had to hide behind rules. He'd say it softly, almost like a prayer, "We're lucky now. We can say I love you, and nobody calls it weakness." The flickering candlelight of the Victorian age had dimmed, but from its glow, a new warmth had risen, one that carried into the modern world. The story of Victorian parenting is not just about cruelty or control. It's about the slow awakening of compassion, the moment humanity realized that gentleness could build stronger hearts than fear ever could. And perhaps that's why, when we think about those long-ago families, we should not only remember their mistakes. We should also remember their courage, the courage to learn how to love differently, one generation at a time. The past, after all, isn't something we escape. It's something we heal from. And in that healing, we find ourselves becoming a little softer, a little kinder, and a little more human than before. The 20th century arrived softly, on the whisper of a new dawn. The streets of London, once choked with soot and horse carts, began to buzz with motor cars. Street lamps glowed brighter. Windows filled with toys made of tin and glass. And for the first time, childhood itself began to look a little like joy. The Victorian age had ended, not with a bang, but with a long, collective sigh. The world had survived its own rigidity, and now, little by little, it was learning to breathe again. In the new Edwardian homes, children's rooms began to change. Where once stood plain wooden beds and strict portraits, now hung curtains in soft colors, shelves lined with storybooks, and little stuffed animals. Parents began reading aloud not to teach manners, but to share moments of calm before sleep. The nursery, once a place of order, became a place of laughter. Magazines started printing columns about child welfare. Doctors began to speak not just of discipline, but of affection, fresh air, and play. The word parenting itself, barely used in the Victorian era, slowly entered everyday language. But the change wasn't just about comfort. It was about rediscovering what it meant to be human. In 1909, an International Congress on Child Welfare was held in London, one of the first of its kind. Reformers, teachers, and physicians gathered to discuss the same question Eleanor Briggs had whispered years before: is gentleness a danger? And the answer, for the first time, was no. The world was beginning to realize that children were not soldiers to be trained, but souls to be nurtured. It was around this time that psychology began shaping parenting in profound ways. The theories of early child development, first whispered by philosophers, then tested by doctors, began to replace sermons and superstition. One of the most influential ideas came from a quiet British doctor named John Bowlby, who introduced the concept of attachment. He proposed something radical for his time, that a child's emotional bond with their caregiver shapes their entire life. Love, he said, wasn't indulgence, it was survival. Without it, children could grow but never truly thrive. His research, published decades after Queen Victoria's death, confirmed what generations of parents had felt but could never express. The love they were once told to restrain was, in truth, the most important gift of all. And yet, this realization came against a backdrop of global turmoil. The First World War arrived like a storm, sudden, cruel, and all-consuming. Families were torn apart. Fathers went to battlefields, mothers to factories. Children were once again left in the care of others, this time, not nannies, but institutions and war relief homes. In those cold dormitories, echoes of the old Victorian discipline returned. Silence, order, obedience. But even in that darkness, new seeds of compassion were being planted. Relief workers began noticing that the children who received warmth and comfort, even a hug or kind word, recovered faster from trauma. Science, it seemed, was proving what love had always known. After the war, when the soldiers came home and the dust settled, a different kind of rebuilding began, not just of cities, but of hearts. Mothers who had been told to stay distant now clung to their children fiercely. Fathers, once stoic, began to show tenderness openly, unable to bear more loss. For a brief, tender moment, love flooded back into the home. The 1920s and 30s became decades of discovery, not only in technology but in emotion. Books like The Child's Mind and The Science of Parenthood filled store shelves. Parents wrote letters to newspapers asking for advice not on punishment, but on understanding. "My son dreams too much," one mother wrote. "Should I scold him or let him dream?" The editor's reply was simple: let him dream. And so, the world began to unlearn centuries of hardness. But it was not an easy process. Many still feared that modern parenting was too soft. "We are raising a generation of weaklings," some critics warned. They longed for the certainty of the old days, where obedience could be measured and silence mistaken for success. Yet, every time the world leaned back toward cruelty, the memory of what came before stopped it, the ghosts of cold nurseries, the echo of wooden chairs, the tears no one saw. As the Second World War erupted, another generation faced fear and loss. Once again, children were evacuated, sent away from cities into the countryside. But this time, their caretakers had learned something. Teachers and foster parents were instructed to provide comfort, not commands. The importance of love was now written not only in hearts but in handbooks. In 1948, the United Nations declared something the Victorians never could have imagined: that children have rights of their own. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights included, for the first time, the recognition that every child deserves protection, care, and affection. It was a quiet victory, born from centuries of silence. By the mid-20th century, parenting manuals no longer spoke of obedience but of empathy. The word discipline began to mean guidance, not punishment. The old Victorian rod, once a symbol of love, was finally laid to rest. Still, history has a strange way of lingering. The shadows of the past do not disappear overnight. Even as modern families grew warmer, the old beliefs sometimes whispered through generations: be tough. Don't cry. Don't spoil the child. The voice of the 19th century, faint but stubborn, still echoed. But with every generation, that echo grew fainter. By the 1960s, children were seen not just as learners but as dreamers, capable of imagination, emotion, and creativity that adults had once dismissed. Playgrounds replaced obedience chairs. Storybooks replaced sermons. Parents began to ask their children how they felt, a question that would have shocked a Victorian household. In those moments, history completed a circle. The same civilization that once taught silence now taught expression. The same society that punished softness began to celebrate it. And if Eleanor Briggs, or Lady Winthrop, or any of those parents from long ago could have seen it, the bedtime stories, the laughter at dinner, the warm hugs before sleep, they might have smiled, even through tears. Because it was all they ever wanted, though they didn't know how to give it. It took a century, and the breaking of an empire, for love to finally be understood not as weakness, but as strength. The Victorian idea of parenting, with its ice baths, rigid silence, and cold correction, became a relic of history. Something to be studied, remembered, and never repeated. And perhaps that's the greatest lesson of all. The story of Victorian parenting isn't about judgment. It's about evolution, the slow, painful, beautiful way humanity learns how to love. We often imagine progress as invention, but sometimes progress is as simple as a hand resting gently on a child's head, saying softly, "It's all right now. You're safe." That simple sentence would have been unthinkable in the old days. And yet, it is the legacy of every child who ever waited in silence, every parent who ever wished they could do better. The fog of Victorian England has lifted. The streets are brighter now, and so are the hearts that walk them. The night settles over London like a blanket of mist, wrapping the rooftops in quiet memory. Somewhere in the city, a child's laughter echoes through an open window, faint, but real. It's the kind of sound that would have startled the Victorians, so unguarded, so free. Yet here it is, alive in the same streets where silence once ruled. And if the old ghosts of those strict nurseries could wander these lanes tonight, perhaps they would stop to listen. They might not recognize this world at first, the colors, the warmth, the ease between parents and children, but they would feel it. They would sense that something they once feared has finally healed. Because love, as it turns out, was never weakness. It was the only thing strong enough to survive history. There's something deeply moving about realizing that every generation parents the next with the lessons of its own wounds. The Victorians, hardened by industrial life, thought love might spoil a child. Modern parents, softened by that same history, now fear not loving enough. Between those extremes lies the quiet truth that kindness is what carries humanity forward. In the 21st century, many of the old laws of child-rearing have become unthinkable. What was once seen as character building, harsh discipline, cold detachment, emotional distance, is now recognized as harm. Today, governments protect children's rights, schools teach emotional well-being, psychologists remind us that affection is not a reward, but a need. But the story of Victorian parenting isn't just about cruelty. It's about the journey from ignorance to understanding, a story of people trying to do right, with the tools and fears they had. Imagine, for a moment, those Victorian mothers, their hands chapped from endless washing, their hearts caught between love and duty. They wanted to raise good children, but the world told them goodness required suffering. Imagine those fathers, silent at dinner tables, wanting to reach out but unable to find the words. They had been told that emotion was weakness, and they carried that weight like armor. They didn't lack love, they lacked permission to show it. And when you see it that way, their story stops being one of villains and victims. It becomes something more tender, a reminder of how slowly the world learns to be gentle. There are still echoes of the old ways, of course. You can find them in phrases passed down through families, in moments of impatience, in the pressure to be perfect. But history's greatest gift is awareness. Once you understand where pain began, you no longer have to pass it on. That's how progress really happens, not in parliaments or textbooks, but in living rooms. In the quiet choice to listen instead of scold. To hold instead of punish. To teach not through fear, but through patience. Somewhere in a small English village, the kind of place where cobblestones remember everything, there stands a house built in the late 1800s. Its walls still bear the faint marks of time, the grooves where furniture once stood, the quiet hum of stories long ended. If you step inside today, you might find something unexpected. A child's bedroom painted with soft stars. A bookshelf filled with stories about kindness, friendship, courage. And perhaps a mother sitting at the bedside, reading aloud with a gentle voice. Once upon a time, there was a world that thought children should never cry. But then, one day, someone decided to listen. In that single sentence, the whole of Victorian parenting unravels and is rewritten. And that's the quiet miracle of human history, the way it transforms pain into wisdom, generation by generation, until what once was cruelty becomes compassion. The obedience chair is gone. The ice baths are gone. The harsh sermons are gone. But the lessons, the deep, aching knowledge of what those things did, remain, guiding us towards something better. Now, instead of fearing tenderness, we celebrate it. Instead of silencing children, we ask them what they think. Instead of demanding perfection, we offer presence. And in that, we have finally done what the Victorians never could, we have made love ordinary. It doesn't always look grand. Sometimes it's as small as a father waiting outside a school gate, or a mother whispering goodnight to a child who can't sleep. Sometimes it's a teacher who notices the quiet student in the back of the class. Sometimes it's simply choosing not to repeat what once was done to us. History, in the end, isn't only written in wars and inventions, it's written in hearts. In the ways we choose to be softer, kinder, quieter than the world before us. So when you close your eyes tonight, and the echoes of the past begin to fade, remember this: every kind act, every gentle word, is a rebellion against centuries of hardness. The Victorian parents, with all their flaws, began a story they could not finish. It took their children, and their children's children, to turn fear into love. And that, perhaps, is the greatest revolution in history, not fought with guns or crowns, but with lullabies. Because one day, in the far future, someone will look back on us, on our rules, our mistakes, our love, and wonder how we ever thought it was enough. They'll learn from us, as we learned from those before. And that's how the world keeps moving, softly, toward light. Outside, the fog has lifted. A soft rain begins to fall, pattering against the old stone paths where children once marched in silence. Now, their laughter runs free through puddles. And somewhere, in the gentle hum of the night, the old world finally rests.